Greetings everyone, and welcome back to the newest lecture. This one is titled Evidence-Based Financial Planning. The purpose of this particular topic is to introduce to you the concept of the appropriate role of science as the foundation for a profession and as what we would suggest is a necessary and essential tool to moving the profession, any profession, but certainly the profession of financial planning, forward. What I'm going to do today is introduce the main theme, give you a little background related to where this topic came from, and then I'll define some terms in terms of what we mean by science and evidence. We'll spend a little time talking about the limits of science. We'll review a case study related to a very specific best practice within the financial planning profession that eventually benefited from some science or some scientific inquiry. And then we'll end with a few thoughts about how we can take these concepts and use them as a foundation, not just for advancing the profession, which of course is extremely important, but also for making ourselves better practitioners. So, our basic proposition is that the financial planning profession currently represents, its body of knowledge represents a blend of sort of intuitive best practices that arose over time through through intuition and sort of I'm going to say a consensus forming process, and some best practices that are actually founded upon real evidence, rigorous evidence that could satisfy the scientific standard. And that if we're truly going to advance as a profession, we believe that we've absolutely arrived at that point where we must have more of the latter and less of the former. And I'll describe exactly what we mean by this in the coming slides. Well, there are many different possible definitions of science. I happen to think this is as good as any. Science is the pursuit of knowledge and understanding of the natural and social world following a systematic methodology based on evidence. That's actually an incredibly powerful statement. It's so compact, and yet there's so much bound up in it. Pursuit of knowledge and understanding of both the natural and social world. This is something that's important to remember. Science is not just confined to biology or astronomy or physics, the so-called hard sciences, but the scientific method and the scientific viewpoint and approach and methodology is absolutely as readily applied to the social world, which is to say also the business world, as it is anywhere else. The other element here that's really important is that science involves a systematic methodology. It's not about intuition, it's not about random chance, it's not about taking your best guess. It's about being systematic and founding any conclusions you draw upon evidence. Now, at the core, at the root of the scientific enterprise are two different methods, two different approaches to reasoning and thinking about the world. The first is deductive reasoning. Now, deductive reasoning is a process that proceeds from the general to the particular. So, when we're using deductive reasoning, we will take some proposition as our starting point, some proposition that seems self-evident, and then we will deduce the implications of that self-evident proposition, and we will arrive at some specific conclusions that follow a logical chain from that self-evident proposition that we used as our starting point. So, for example, here's an example of deductive reasoning. All penguins are birds. All birds are animals. Ergo, all penguins are animals. It's also known as a syllogism. So we've taken a general proposition and we have deduced the logical consequences of that general proposition. The other form of reasoning found in science is inductive reasoning. And inductive reasoning proceeds from the particular to the general. Deductive reasoning began with the general and led through a logical chain of reasoning to the particular. Inductive reasoning begins with the particular, begins with a particular observation. We observe something in the world. We observe some phenomenon. We seem to observe it repeatedly. We begin to draw conclusions from the accumulation of observations of these specific phenomenon, and these conclusions lead us to a generalized theory of some phenomenon that arose from the individual's particular observations. So, for example, we might observe that hundreds of species of penguins have been observed so far, and all are swimmers. And so from these hundreds of particular observations, we might therefore conclude with a more generalized theory that all species of penguins are swimmers. Now, in reality, science invariably employs both of these, both inductive and deductive reasoning, in a combination, because they tend to support each other. As we make individual observations about phenomena in the world, and these individual and particular observations eventually accumulate to the point where we begin to draw some general conclusions. Well, those general conclusions can then be the jumping off point for the deductive process, where we then begin to reason or deduce natural implications of this general conclusion or this general theory we're proposing, and that leads us back to particular predictions of what will flow from that. Now, when you think about the best practices that make up the financial planning profession's body of knowledge, you'll find that they actually very clearly arrive from both deductive and inductive sources. You know, some of them are clearly derived from self-evident propositions that were taken to their natural conclusion, and others indicate more the character of something that arises from the slow accumulation of observation. The thing is that this should be the case, that these best practices that are so often inadequate in our way of thinking should have arisen nonetheless by these deductive and inductive methods isn't really surprising. It's really an example of how the human brain is wired. In fact, it's interesting. There was a piece of research reported just in the last week or two in which the researchers indicated that they had, in studying infants, they had come to realize that infants practice scientific reasoning at the earliest ages. When faced with different objects, they would interact with them in an experimental sort of way. And they would think very logically about how to understand the objects that they were trying to interpret. Interestingly, this only lasts for the first few years of life, and then eventually this scientific intuition seems to become overwhelmed by an accumulation of other aspects of learning, where opinion and belief begin to trump the native and natural scientist in all of us at the time of birth. Now, here's another statement about science. Albert Einstein said, the whole of science is nothing more than a refinement of everyday thinking. Everyday thinking. You know, you don't normally think of that, but this is kind of related to the observation that I just made, that so many of our best practices in financial planning seem to have arisen through everyday thinking, through some emerging consensus that didn't really follow a formal process. The key here in this statement is the word refinement. It's in the refinement of that everyday thinking that we rise from the anecdotal to the scientific. So most of our best practices, they stop at the formation of a belief. You'll note that when we were looking at inductive and deductive reasoning, let's start with induction. You observe some phenomenon in the world, and you observe it repeatedly, you begin to form a belief as to the underlying mechanism that's giving rise to that. Well, many of our financial planning practices stop there. They stop with the formation of a belief. But science requires that we go further. Science requires that once we have formed a belief about the underlying mechanism that we're observing, or the underlying mechanism of the individual phenomena that we've been observing, once we form that belief, we must craft that into a hypothesis that can be formally tested. Once we've taken our belief to the next level, once we've formed a hypothesis, we can then go out and collect additional data that will allow us to either confirm or refute the hypothesis. So it's that hypothesis testing that's important. But to allow ourselves to form a belief and then leave it at that, and maybe the belief seems to be reinforced by our informal daily experience. Well, that's based on anecdotal evidence, and if we're going to be based upon the best available evidence, we must take it to the next level. And this is not the norm within our profession. So what do we mean by evidence? We're talking about propositions that have been formally tested, and they've either been validated or invalidated. They've been verified in some fashion. Now this gets into a tricky area, because in science, you form a hypothesis, you never prove a hypothesis. You only fail to disprove it. You only fail to disprove it. You can never say that because I ran this test, and the results seem consistent with my hypothesis, I have proven that this is the underlying phenomenon. All you can ever really say is I have not disproven it. It has not been disproven. And so it's a very, it may sound like a subtle difference, but it's very important, because what it does is it recognizes that at any point down the line, new evidence might arise. And so if there's always the possibility of new evidence, there's never the possibility of saying something absolutely and definitively once and for all. We must always be open to the new evidence that may arrive at any day, on any day. Yes, now this notion of the appropriate standards of evidence, this is where, again, the scientific enterprise that has grown up over the centuries gives us a lot of information about how to establish appropriate standards for the question at hand. And the standard isn't the same for every type of research and every type of question and every type of environment. The standards of evidence that we might look for in particle physics is not going to be the same standard of evidence that we're going to be looking for in social research and research within the business realm. So, evidence-based financial planning is the use of financial planning best practices that have been validated by some formal standard of evidence. And furthermore, we don't stop there. We have to have our eyes open and be prepared to identify those best practices that are not empirically validated. Empirically means by observation, by collection of data. So it's not enough to say, well, this has been validated. We need to also be alert to those that have not been validated and to make a commitment to doing so. Assuming it's testable, if they give rise to a testable hypothesis, by God, we should form that hypothesis and test it, or drop its use. Now, I want to be very clear here that what we're talking about is science and not scientism. Scientism is essentially the deification of science. It's making a fetish of science, and it's essentially worshiping anything that appears to be scientific. Real science, true science, has to be practiced with a proper sense of humility and a deep sense of limits, because science is very modest in its scope. Those who haven't thought much about the philosophy and the methodology of science sometimes think that science is arrogant and that science and scientists believe that their mode of inquiry encompasses anything and everything, and this is where I think you get into fights over whether or not there's a war between science and religion and so forth. But true science is much more modest in its scope. I always like to reference Karl Popper, who was a philosopher of science. He said a number of interesting things that he did wonderful work on defining the appropriate methodology of science. But some of what he said is really appropriate, is an appropriate corrective for those who think that science has no boundaries. First of all, one of his most famous statements was, "Insofar as a scientific statement speaks about reality, it must be falsifiable. And insofar as it is not falsifiable, it does not speak about reality." Now, to make that maybe a little clearer, if it needs it, Karl Popper was the founder of what came to be known as the falsificationist school within the philosophy of science, and what that school of thought represents is this understanding or this belief that a proposition, in order to be considered scientific, must be, at least in principle, falsifiable. So if I make a statement that is not subject to falsification, if it would be impossible to conceive of any way to falsify my statement, then we have to say that that statement falls outside the bounds of science. So for example, if I were to say 10 million angels can dance on the head of a pin, well, the question you would have to ask is, can we observe angels? Are they visible to us? Can we observe how many? Can we actually count how many angels are dancing on the head of a pin? Well, of course the answer is not. So that statement I just made may or may not be true, but it's not falsifiable. There's no way to test that statement. And if it doesn't give rise to a testable hypothesis, it's not a scientific statement. It doesn't mean it's bad or foolish or wrong or anything else. It simply means that it falls outside the scope of science. And so this is one of the things, this is one of the points where you can see that science is in fact very modest in its scope. Only those statements or propositions that are potentially subject to falsification, that, to put it another way, give rise to testable hypotheses, only those statements or propositions fall within the scientific realm. Well, there's a finite number of such propositions, whereas the propositions or statements we might make that are not subject to falsification, that do not give rise to testable hypotheses, the number of such statements is infinite. So science, properly approached, is very modest in its scope, and it's important to be clear that if something isn't scientific, if something is immune to scientific inquiry, again, the only real statement you can make is that it falls outside the scope of science. So it's at that point where you realize there really is no conflict between the scientific enterprise and anything else, the scientific enterprise and religious belief, the scientific enterprise and mysticism. They simply don't overlap. They simply don't overlap. Now I'd like to turn to a case study involving a financial planning best practice. Some years ago, back in the 90s, the CFP Board of Standards convened various work groups to develop a sort of a body of best practices that were an attempt to capture what the professional community of practitioners believed to be the best practices with respect to their work with client, how they engage clients, how they serve them, how they advise them. And so the group developed a series of best practices. One of them was establishing the scope of the engagement and encompassed the discovery, what we often refer to as the discovery process. And that was the CFP Practice Standard 200-1. And it reads in part, the financial planning practitioner and the client shall mutually define the client's personal and financial goals, needs, and priorities that are relevant to the scope of the engagement before any recommendation is made or implemented. It furthermore goes on to say, in order to arrive at such a definition, the practitioner will need to explore the client's values, attitudes, expectations, and time horizons as they affect the client's goals, needs, and priorities. So it's very clearly laying out what begins to sound like a fairly deep and formalized discovery process, right? It goes on to say the role of the practitioner is to facilitate the goal-setting process in order to clarify with the client goals and objectives. So again, even going further in making it clear that this is meant to be, this discovery process up front is meant to be a systematic part of what the financial planner does. And then the rationale that's provided, again still in the practice standard, is that goals and objectives provide focus, purpose, vision, and direction for the financial planning process. Now, these are statements. You can see where these came from. I mean, first of all, they seem self-evidently true, right? You can see that there was a deductive process here where self-evidently true statements were used as a starting point. And you can also see how the practitioners who had decades of experience, the practitioners who formed these in the work groups, had many decades of experience, and collectively they had centuries worth of experience. And you can see also how their experiences reflected in this, that they understood that when there was this comprehensive and systematic approach, that it had led to good results. And so there was a bit of inductive reasoning there too. Nonetheless, that's as far as it went. These work groups wrote these up and ratified them without reference to external research or formal scientific research related to these or any other element of the practice standards. But the scientific research came later. So years later, a decade or more later, Carol Anderson and Deanna Sharp conducted some formal scientific research into this question. Carol Anderson, you should know, is the founder of Money Quotient, and you've had the benefit of using some of the Money Quotient tools. Deanna Sharp is a full-time academic, and the two of them published a white paper with FPA that is available, and I think may even be available among your readings. If it isn't, I'll make sure that we've placed it there, because this is really good research. Anyway, so they went out and they gathered data and about both how planners engage their clients, planner attitudes about different ways of engaging their clients, different forms of communication and different topics and different approaches to engaging their clients in the discovery process. And they also had the opportunity to gather data from clients themselves. And it was very interesting. They found, and there's a lot more to this, and you saw a little bit of this in the first lecture, the second lecture on the finding the planning of financial planning. And we can return to this if you like, but I'm going to make sure the paper is available to you as a reading this week. Anyway, so they found that clients place a very high value on their planner having a systematic process for uncovering goals and values. And a systematic process, among other things, was associated with higher levels of client trust and relationship commitment. There's actually been a number of different research projects that have shown that. Now, you may also recall from prior lectures that client trust and relationship commitment is not a trivial thing to achieve, because higher degrees of it's also been shown that higher degrees or higher levels of client trust and relationship commitment are associated with a higher propensity to reveal personal and financial information, a higher propensity to actually implement financial planning recommendations, more functional conflict, which is to say an ability to remain more functional when conflicts do arise, and not coincidentally even a higher propensity to make referrals. So what this tells us is that anything that can lead to a higher level of client trust and relationship commitment is actually going to result in a more effective financial planning engagement, because first of all, the client will reveal more personal and financial information, and the more personal and financial information you have, the better type of analysis you can perform. It will also result in clients having a higher propensity to implement. And we have to know that a financial plan or financial planning recommendations are worthless if they don't get implemented. You're not being a change agent if you don't actually implement those. So here we've begun to validate. The evidence is in that clients value it. It clearly leads to more, this systematic approach clearly leads to more effective financial planning engagements. So it would seem that we now have some formally collected and formally analyzed evidence done within the scientific process that has begun to validate and put a scientific foundation under that previously anecdotal practice standard. But here's the piece that is interesting and perhaps even somewhat alarming. The thing that Carol and Deanna did further was, as I mentioned, they also gathered data from financial planners about their attitudes and their actual practice. And one of the things that they found was that when they asked when they asked planners to evaluate the statement, "I use a systematic process for helping my clients clarify their values and priorities," only 59% agreed with that statement. When further asked to evaluate the statement, "I use a goal-setting process to help my clients establish meaningful personal financial goals and objectives," again, only 59% agreed. So more than 40%, more than 4 in 10 of the planners surveyed indicated that they do not use a formal process. So in many ways, for me, the question that follows is, well, now that this former long-standing best practice has actually been validated by formal empirical research, will this change the number of financial planners who actually engage in this formal process? If we're going to truly emerge as a profession, I would suggest that it needs to change. The planners need to be alert to the emergence of new evidence and incorporate that evidence when it's compelling, incorporate it into their actual practice with clients. So of course, as I just said, clients would be better off, the profession would be better off. We need to have a mechanism for creating new knowledge, for validating our best practices, and then for disseminating that information. Both disseminating it, you might say on the push side, but also as practitioners, we have to learn to be alert to the availability of new evidence. And then we also need to have a low threshold for incorporating that new evidence when it's compelling into our actual daily work. So this should look familiar to you from last week's lecture on financial planner as strategist. And as you may recall from that lecture, I talked about the fact that the available evidence suggests that a balanced approach to advising clients, a balanced approach to engaging them, and a balanced approach to developing strategies is the most effective way, both from the standpoint of meeting their needs, both from the standpoint of being an effective change agent, and from the standpoint of fostering the highest degree of trust and relationship commitment from clients. So we know that in the ideal, the evidence shows us that in the ideal, we want to engage our clients in a balanced way. We want to bring all 3 of these main sort of strategy-making modes into play equally in our engagement with clients. But as you will also recall from last week, when you actually gather evidence, you find that in fact, planners are highly diverse. There's a huge dispersal of focus and engagement across these different modes. The planners, the practitioners, tend to slide into these, what I call strategic comfort zones. But the evidence tells us otherwise. So now there is a growing body of evidence that says sliding into that, quite naturally sliding into that strategic comfort zone is not the most effective way to practice and not the most effective way to serve our clients. And so will this emerging evidence also change the way in which we practice and change the way in which we prepare ourselves and engage with our clients? So you've seen all this evidence last week. I've just reiterated, so I'll leave it at that. Again, indeed, clients would be better off. We would be better off as a profession. We would be more effective as practitioners. So again, will practitioners be alert to the evidence as it emerges and change the way they practice? I will tell you that having given this presentation, this financial planner strategist presentation, now 3 or 4 times, I will say that the reaction, the feedback I get from the live audiences is very compelling. They find the concept, when faced with the evidence, when offered the model, and then offered the evidence for some of the implications of the model, they're very open to it, and they find it very compelling. And I'm very heartened by what I've seen in the sort of the 3 live presentations I've done to date. And one of you saw that most recent live presentation a week ago Friday, or a week ago from today. So if we look into our profession, some of the examples of some of our best practices that are currently founded upon some pretty good evidence. Monte Carlo analysis, safe withdrawal policies, especially those as proposed by Guyton and Klinger, which, as you all know, we think represent a really good example of policy-based financial planning. Obviously, standard finance, sort of quantitative finance, and the related tools that we use, that are used in corporate finance and that we also use as financial planners, are very well founded on evidence and on science. Likewise, behavioral finance, economics, communication, risk tolerance. This is all work where there's all areas where there's always more work to do, but where there is some foundation upon which we can build when we incorporate some of these tools and these practices into our work with clients. There are a lot of areas where there is more work to do, where there are questions that have not been addressed, that have not been answered in a truly systematic way. And this, in fact, is the good news, bad news. We're never going to run out of questions. As practitioners, we will never run out of questions that could benefit us if they were addressed in a systematic and scientific fashion. So the traditional 6-step process incorporates many of the formal sciences, and there's a lot of science there already. And so this is just the barest sketch. Obviously, establishing and defining the client-planner relationship, which also relates to that practice standard 200-1 that we just examined. Communication science, psychology, sociology, those are all present there. Gathering client data, including goals. Again, we're into neuroscience and neuroeconomics, behavioral finance. I mean, all of these things that make us effective as planners and change agents potentially have roots in the available sciences. Analyzing and evaluating status, developing and presenting recommendations. Again, not all of it, but a lot of it is number crunching, and a lot of it is financial and economic analysis. Simulations like Monte Carlo analysis, Monte Carlo simulations. These are some very powerful tools that we have available to us. These are, and of course, all of these you may not fail to notice, those all live kind of in the data-driven mode of strategy making, and we know that we have many other tools to bring to bear, including those from the policy-driven mode and the relationship-driven mode in developing tools for developing recommendations and alternative clients. Implementation, of course, is where a lot of the policy and policy and relationship-driven mode tools can come into play. But all of these areas potentially contain science if we're open to it and we're focused on using the best available science. So a point that's important to make is that sometimes we think about we think in terms of the whole-on, we think in terms of integralism, and we'll say, well, there's this exterior realm and there's an interior realm, and the exterior realm, you may recall, there's the individual exterior, which includes all those things, those objective facts that are particular to me, and then there's the collective exterior, which involves all of those objective facts that are sort of not particular to me but out there in the world. That there are sciences that go along with that exterior realm, finance, economics, and so forth. Very often, over the decades, we've often heard the phrase, the art and science of financial planning. And I think that almost invariably, at least in the past, almost invariably, that phrase, when it was being used, was meant to suggest that the science of financial planning are all of our quantitative tools and all of our quantitative knowledge domains that live in the exterior, and that the work we do on the interior is the artful part of what we do. And this is where Elisa and I would take exception. We look at it and say, no, there are formal sciences that allow us to deal with the exterior realm, and there are formal sciences that allow us to deal with the interior realm. Psychology, sociology, neuroeconomics, behavioral finance, these are all scientific disciplines and are all amenable to the scientific modes of inquiry just as much as those modes of inquiry that operate in the exterior realm. So when we think about the art and science of financial planning, we take a slightly different approach. We think of it as the artful application of both the interior and exterior sciences of financial planning. So there is a role for art. There is a role for art, but it's in the artful application of all of our sciences. And that artful application, part of that is about strategy. You know, I talk a lot about financial planner as strategist. And the thing about strategy, it's a fundamentally creative act. Strategy is a creative combination of our best available thoughts and tools, but in its implementation, these creative strategies we come up with need to be tested and implemented using the best available and most grounded science. So there's always room for art, but it's not in opposition to or exclusive of the scientific realm. It's the artful and creative application of the best available sciences. So let's talk for a moment about what needs to happen for us to become better practitioners, for us to do our part, to not just be better practitioners, but to help move this whole profession forward. One of the things that's required is an ability to actually read and evaluate research. You know, this is one of the things that you find in other professions. There is some training and some ability to read the best available research and incorporate it into practice. Whether you're a physician or an attorney or any other practitioner, and we need to be able to do the same. You know, if I look around, I'm looking at my desk right now, and I see a stack a foot tall of magazines, financial planning magazines, and of the 8 or 10 that are sitting there, there are only 2 that publish material that's actually based on any kind of formal research. One of them is the Journal of Financial Planning, the contributions section. It's called Contributions. You know, the Journal of Financial Planning has kind of 2. It's almost like two magazines pushed together. You know, one is opinion columns and current events and so forth, and the other is more like an academic journal, and that's the contributions section. And those are peer-reviewed articles that tend to more readily or more regularly feature formal research. And the other is the Financial Services Academy Review, the FSA Review, the AFS, the Academy of Financial Services Review. The Academy of Financial Services is an association primarily aimed at academic practitioners, at academics who teach within financial planning programs. Although as a practitioner you're free to join. Elise and I are both members of the AFS. And the AFS Review, the Financial Services Review, is a compendium of research-based articles. Not exclusively on the practice of financial planning. Some of the articles address pedagogical issues, issues related to teaching and so forth, as you might expect from an association that's primarily made up of academics. But of the 8 or 10 sitting on my desk, and that doesn't include all of them. I mean, there are 15 or 20 that show up on all of our desks on a weekly or monthly basis. Only those are the only 2 I can point to that actually attempt to publish formal research. Okay, so now get off that. If that was a soapbox, I'll get off of it now. So let's ask the next question. What do you have? How do you use formal research? Assuming you can lay your hands on it, what do you do with it? Well, we propose that there are 8 questions you should be able to answer. And in fact, as I may have mentioned before, within our firm, within Yeski Buie, we conduct what we call Yeski Buie University, or often referred to as Yebu U. And Yebu U involves reading from among the classics, reading Markowitz's original article on portfolio optimization from the 50s, reading from more contemporary articles, reading the Guyton and Klinger work and other bits of research that are published in the journal. We're always focused on both deepening our foundation and by reading and evaluating the classics, and by reading new research as it comes out and evaluating it. Well, these 8 questions that I'm about to share with you are the 8 questions that we challenge our financial planning team to answer in evaluating in the process of reading and evaluating any of the research that becomes part of our syllabus. First, what is the problem or question that the author or authors is addressing? I mean, this is really important. It sounds obvious, but it's not always obvious. You need to be able to actually clearly state, why are they doing this? Why did they do this research? Why did they do this research? And invariably, you will be able to say it was because they identified a problem, and they wanted to see if they could more deeply understand the problem, if there would be a solution. Or they had a question. They had a question about how the world works, and they realized that it was going to be, that there were testable hypotheses that rose from this question, and so they went about pursuing an answer to that question. So you need to be able to clearly articulate what was the problem they were addressing, or what was the question they were trying to answer. How was the problem or question conceptualized? How was it framed? How was it positioned? Why is it important? Why would anyone care? So how was it conceptualized? Was it what kind of a test was developed, or what kind of what was the larger context within which this problem or question was positioned? What are the key findings from prior research? Now, formal research always involves examining the available body of knowledge to see what has been done to address this question or problem in the past. You know, it was Isaac Newton who was famous for saying, "If I have seen farther than other men, it is because I stood on the shoulders of giants." And what he was saying was, he had the benefit of centuries and millennia of human learning as a foundation upon which he could stand and take it to the next level, and the next level beyond that. And so, in the spirit of that, any scientific research must acknowledge and incorporate prior findings. Otherwise, it's like you're starting from scratch every day, and there's never any sense of advancement. Science advances because we all, as researchers today, stand on the shoulders of giants. We are able to build on what has gone before. So every write-up of research should include some reference to what was done before, and how we used that, incorporated that, and how we propose to build on it. What was the methodology? Many different methodologies can be employed to answer a scientific question. The methodology has to be appropriate to the question at hand. So if if you're carrying out some research in particle physics, you're going to need a cyclotron. That's the tool you're going to need, and the methodology is going to be related to tests using that tool. On the other hand, if you're conducting research within a business environment, there's a good chance that you're going to be collecting survey data. So what was the data collection methodology, and then what was the methodology for analyzing that data? What were the results of the testing? Once we've determined how they formed the question, the method that they chose to then test that question, what kind of data did they collect, and how did they test that data, what were the results? You need to be able to describe very clearly the outcome of those tests. And just as important, were the results compelling? Because sometimes the results are weak. Sometimes the evidence only weakly supports a particular hypothesis. And sometimes it very strongly. And so we have to ask the question, were the results robust? Were the results compelling? And if they were, what are the practical applications? What are the practical, perhaps I should say, what are the practical implications for us? Because we are practitioners. We are, financial planning is a profession that's devoted to practice, that's devoted to engaging and serving clients. And so as a practicing profession, we have to know what the practical applications or implications of these results are, and how will this change the way we practice? Or perhaps to begin with, will it change the way we practice? If the practical implication, if the results are compelling and the practical applications are clear, well then we need to take that next step and say, well then, okay, so how would we incorporate this into our practice? So another piece that's very important is to recognize that no true profession has ever developed absent a formal and a deep relationship between the academic community and the practitioner community. And the reason is that financial planners are on the front lines, working day in and day out with clients, helping them solve old problems and new. And so the financial planners, they know what the essential questions are that have to be addressed for them to become more effective as practitioners. The problem is, Financial planners are not generally, or very rarely, are they trained as researchers. However, academics, that is their stock in trade. They have been trained to conduct formal research. If you can give them a question and help them articulate the reason for the question or the problem to be addressed, if the reason why that's important, they can go to the next step. They can say, okay, now that I understand the problem or the question, I can conceptualize it. I can think about the type of evidence we need to collect, how we need to test that evidence, and then how we need to position the results within the context of what's gone before. So that this is really an essential partnership. This is truly an essential partnership, and one that I would hope every practitioner would be open to doing their part to forge ties to the academic community and provide feedback and ideas, and also be open to absorbing what the academics have to say. Sometimes the results of academic research may seem academic. It may feel like it doesn't have relevance for practice, but if you challenge yourself to think a little more deeply and say, well, wait a minute, let me think a little more deeply about this and see if I can find a way to connect this academic finding to how I practice or how I might practice. So it requires an openness to be engaged, and it requires an openness to maybe think a little harder about the product of academic research and how it might in fact influence you. And it means being a good partner. It's only when we forge those deep connections that we are truly going to step into the ranks of true profession. So finally, I'll end by just with a few suggestions that Professor Bowie and I have for the essential next steps. First of all, we all, as members of this profession, must commit ourselves to an evidence-based body of knowledge, that we're going to base our practices as much as we possibly can on evidence derived formally from a scientific process, a scientific form of inquiry. That we're going to identify and accumulate the appropriate training around the best available science and tools. It doesn't mean that every practicing financial planner has to become a scientist or an academic, but it does require a willingness to accumulate the skills necessary to at least be a good consumer of research. There's one of the things that we're working on is developing an 8-week sort of a short course that hopefully can be offered through Cyber Campus that would be devoted to evaluating research, or evaluating research in financial planning, or maybe evaluating research for financial planners. But the key is that it would be a short course that would be devoted to teaching the methodology that's used within science and research. Again, not with the intent of making financial planners into researchers, although that would not be a bad thing necessarily, but making them better consumers of research. And this is just what I'm talking about. There are many ways to do this. There are books, there are magazines. Elisa and I were at the FPA San Diego conference, and we did a breakout session on this topic. And it was a very brief session, but I think we drew almost 100 people. And at one point we asked the audience, how many of you would attend a conference session that was devoted to helping deepen your skills at evaluating formal research? I think, as far as I could tell, every single hand in the room went up. And finally, to repeat a point I made in relation to the last slide, we really need to have more and deeper practitioner academic partnerships in order to conduct and in order to be feeding the right topics to the academics, and then being good consumers of the resulting research, and all with the purpose of building a profession that is better at serving its clients because it's basing what it does on the best available evidence. And with that, thank you, and I look forward to talking to you again next week.